There's been so much popular pressure. It's almost like this popular uprising has taken place, demanding that we release the Peter Hitchens video. Here's the full video. We did have to stop and start the video for various reasons. There was a bunch of very enthusiastic children, for example.
Unlike people I think I might need to wait a second longer, actually.
I hope when you watch it you realise there wasn't some grand conspiracy and we were just trying to edit it so people could watch it. But I hope you enjoy it. I think Peter is in great form.
That's right, it's all right.
But it is a one-off, because otherwise poor Adam here is going to have an absolute nightmare of having to do a normal edited video and the full video. What I want to start with actually is your family, your background, because your dad, he was a naval officer, he was in the Royal Navy, wasn't he?
Yeah.
I don't know, just tell me a bit about your parents. What influence do you think your parents, the lasting influence they've had on you in terms of your beliefs, your thoughts,
well, actually,
your outlook?
I've often thought about this, probably not all that much, because they stood back an awful lot from my upbringing. Not because I think they wanted to, but because they felt they ought to. They sent both my brother and me to boarding schools from a very early age. And my mother it's quite funny this, my mother must have been in the 1950s one of the very few mothers who went out to work. And during the school holidays, my brother and I would run pretty much wild. There was nobody there most of the time. So actually, I'm not trying to be disrespectful or anything, their influence on me was quite small.
That's interesting. With your brother, obviously, you two, you're both huge figures in your own right. And growing up, what was your relationship?
Oh, adversarial. We were not close enough to be, we weren't twins or anything like that, to be the good friends that siblings sometimes can be. We weren't far enough apart to be wholly independent of each other, so we were fighting for the same territory a lot of the time, and quite frequently descended into violence.
Were you both quite ambitious from an early age?
He certainly was. I think I may have picked it up from him. I look back on my childhood as being a period of almost total relaxation. I really wasn't worried about anything. It was a kind of dream time. It was only much later that I realised it might be necessary to be ambitious. I think he was ambitious from the moment he emerged from the womb.
But you scrapped?
Oh yes.
Wow. So did anyone bully anyone? Or it wasn't like that?
I don't know whether the word bullying these days has so many applications. He was bigger than I was, but I like to think I could hit quite hard.
Sure you did.
But he was very good at pretending that I hadn't hurt him, which is annoying.
Oh, I see. Okay,
Yeah.
It's one of those. Just, with your brother and everything, later on in life, your relationship was often quite strained, wasn't it?
Not really. It was more distant than strained. He decided he loved rows. And he decided to have a row with me about something I wrote, which oddly enough, I'd sent it to him in advance to let him know I was going to write it. And also, I'd said before, in his presence, I found out this out later. If I'd known it at the time, it would have made it even more ridiculous. I'd said it before, in his presence, on an interview with C-SPAN, with Brian Lamb, exactly the same thing, and he'd laughed. But on this occasion, he decided he was going to make a war out of it, so he did. It was when I reminded him that he had taken a fairly relaxed view of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Just after he'd become a sort of American super patriot, just after September the 11th.
I mean, what were
The timing is all, I think, but he decided to make a really big row out of that.
So he liked to pick his rows, you think?
He had a great row with James Fenton, who's the most inoffensive person you could ever meet, about the Falkland Islands. For ages he wasn't on speaking terms with James. It's very hard not to be on speaking terms with James, but he managed to do it.
Put the effort in.
Well, James is just such a nice person. It just is. I mean, it would just be very hard to have a row with him, but he managed to do it over the Falklands. I remember it well. And I think he did it because he enjoyed it.
Were you, in the end, how ideologically different were you? What were the main differences you had with him?
Ideologically? Well, not really very. He sort of introduced me to... There wasn't all that much politics in our household until he went off to the Lees School, Cambridge, at the age of 13, and he was ahead of me, so he was there and I wasn't. And in the 1964 general election, he somehow or other the school held a mock election, he became the Labour candidate. And I think also, I've never been able to pin this down, he came under the influence of a charismatic teacher who was, amongst other things, of the left. And he came home and he was absolutely full of it. And I found it rather appealing. And after a while I thought, yeah, I felt persuaded by it. But there was really not much politics in our house until then, I don't think, not that I can recall.
I mean, after he died, how did you fit, in terms of his followers, I suppose? Do you make a distinction between those, you know, the way he's been portrayed and the brother you actually...
No, the fanboys are impossible. They have obviously have absolutely no idea what kind of person he was. In fact, there was an illustration of this at the memorial event in New York City, where quite a lot of it consisted of people reading out things that he'd written. Now, I have to say that most of us there in the front rows, the sort of invited guests, were very familiar with these, and we thought it's nice to hear this again, but and we're being reminded of things that he said and wrote, which were good. But we didn't, even at the jokes, double up with laughter. But towards the back of the room, where the fans had come in, they were all hooting with laughter at these things, because they'd obviously never heard or read them before. They hadn't read his work. They didn't actually know. All they knew was here was this person who had come along and given religion a kicking, which is what was really important to them about him, what made him a rock star in the United States. I've always thought the college generation in the US, brought up in religious homes, under the influence of pastors, going to church, then going to college, wanting to live a life of sex and drugs and rock and roll, and really being delighted to find an articulate, educated voice saying to them, that's okay, all your pastors are stupid, all the religious ideas you've been fed are bunkum, and what your parents have told you doesn't count for anything. And I think that's what did it. I only realized it when I went and did that dreadful debate with him at Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I expected to be in a small room with perhaps 150 people who were vaguely interested, and found myself in a huge converted church with 1,000 people who hated me.
Oh, is that how it felt?
Well, they did. They didn't hate me because of anything personal. They hated me because they'd come to see Christopher, and they couldn't work out what I was doing there. It was like going to see the big movie and finding you had to sit through a B picture for half an hour first. I felt their pain. I understood why it was they were annoyed, because as it dawned on me what was actually going on, that Christopher had become a rock star, I could see why it was my presence was completely superfluous.
It must have felt surreal to be in a situation like that. You're with your brother, and you're there surrounded by his fan base who are very hostile to you.
Well, they became more hostile to me the more they knew who I was and what I thought. The more hostile they became. To begin with, it was just, what is this guy doing here? As the evening went on, it was, what is this guy doing here, and we hate him.
Did you enjoy that to a degree, though? Did you kind of relish being...
I didn't enjoy that evening at all, no, because I hadn't prepared for it. I came a long way.
Yeah.
I'd been actually quite enjoying the trip, and I'd been looking forward to the evening. I thought it would be quite humorous and relaxed. And it became quite serious. And also, there was another profound problem. Christopher, by then, had got his anti-theist acts together. It was pretty much wholly formed. And he didn't, as far as I could see, really care very much what I said. He would say the same thing anyway. But I quite needed to know what he was saying so I could rebut it. But the sound system was such that I couldn't hear what he was saying. At one point, I actually had to go down into the audience to try and pick it up.
Oh, no.
It was awful. People sometimes write to me and say, I really enjoyed that debate between you and your brother in Grand Rapids. Could you have enjoyed it?
Oh, what a nightmare.
It's awful.
In terms of you, so, I mean, earlier on, what a lot of people don't know is for a while, you know, because people see you now, right from the Mail on Sunday, someone on the right of politics, although we'll talk about that as well, but you used to be a Trotskyist for a while.
Certainly was, yeah.
You were in the International Socialists, which, for people who don't know, is the forerunner of the Socialist Workers' Party.
Yeah, it was, in those days, balmy as we may have been, we did not believe that 3,000 people could constitute a political party. In exalted moments, we called ourselves a tendency, but we would never have called ourselves a party.
How did you get involved with the IS at the time?
Well, through Christopher, who had, I think, got involved with it through Peter Sedgwick, who pretty much got him in. And then I was looking at this stage, and several things, but I was looking for an organisation. I was a great joiner. I was 17. I was looking for an organisation I could join, and there it was, the Oxford IS, meeting every Thursday evening, I think it was, above the Port Mahon pub in St Clement's. Still remember it.
And this was more than a flirtation. You were a true believer for a while.
Oh, very much so, yeah.
You believed the socialist revolution was...
I thought that Marxism and Leninism had pretty much the answer to the problems of the world, yeah.
How do you look back at that now, given where you
Well,
stand?
it was a reasonable mistake to have made. I'm glad I made it because, unlike people who've been vaccinated against a disease, I've actually had the disease, and therefore I'm totally immune from it in a way that a mere vaccination couldn't possibly provide. And
Are you
I'm glad of
repulsed
that.
by those beliefs that you had then?
Am I?
Repulsed by what you believed in?
I can't, you see, in all honesty, you can't pretend that you didn't do it. It was something that you did, that you meant at the time, that brought you into contact with many people, some of whom you liked at the time, and would still like if it weren't for the political gulf that's now opened up between you. It would be a dishonesty and a betrayal to say that there's nothing in it that I learnt from, or that I enjoyed, or that I could recommend. It taught me how to think in a lot of ways. So I don't regret the experience at all.
It's interesting.
I think everybody should have it in a way, but it's just not available to most people.
It's interesting because a lot of people got their political education from these groups. I mean, I could go through frontline politicians, whether it be Eric Pickles, a conservative, he was although he was a tank, he was a communist, or whether it be half of New Labour. Where
it's fascinating, isn't it?
Ex-Trotsky. Is that political education?
Unlike me, Eric is reasonably frank about it, I think. But unlike me, most of them, especially the Labour ones, tend to be very coy about discussing it. I think it's actually because it's much more important to them than it is to me, and also because it still has much more influence over them than it has on me, and that's why they don't like talking about it.
But as well as the political education, I suppose, the interest and ideas maybe it gave you, do you think also there's still a thread in terms of your political passion, I suppose? You know, your sense of having an ideological commitment, which you still have. And has that...
Well, I don't really have an ideological commitment, actually. I wouldn't say I did. I've sought rather to avoid ideological commitments or any form of utopianism or anything of that kind.
One thing I was going to ask you about that is, do you think the difference partly between... So the similarity between me and you is that we're outside a political consensus in a certain way. But for me, it's the economic consensus, the so-called neoliberal or free market consensus. For you, it's the kind of socially liberal consensus.
Yeah.
Is that how you'd...
Well, I mean, certainly, but I'm not that keen on the free market consensus either.
I know, that's what I want to ask you about.
It doesn't seem to me to be an answer to anything. It's an attempt. All these things are attempts to construct some kind of total worldview without religion.
Well, on the free market,
the market for a lot of nominal conservatives who aren't actually conservatives at all, in general liberals, the market has become a substitute for God. They see Adam Smith's hidden hand as a kind of divine providence.
So a lot of people don't realise you support, for example, you'd prefer public ownership of the railways, for example.
Immediately, yeah, let's have it.
Wow. I mean, you've called yourself a social democrat before as well, I've seen.
Well, sort of. I mean, it's a way of explaining how my ideas tend. It's probably not strictly accurate because there's still, in real social democracy, there's still an element of Marxism, and I'm not that. But in terms of actually trying to work out how to organise a society sensibly, then obviously the intervention of the state in a lot of areas is essential. You can manage without it. Even the most, I mean, there are wild conservative, liberal free marketeers who say that you don't need a navy. It could be done by sort of privateers patrolling the seas on your behalf. But it's obviously ridiculous. Every state has to intervene in something. And once you've decided you must intervene by creating a navy, then you've pretty much sold the principle, haven't you? The state's obviously useful sometimes, in which case it can't be. You can't rule it out as being useful at any other time, except on pragmatic grounds.
Before I go just to talk about some of your specific ideas, I suppose if I was going to come up, I mean, not just in terms of obviously the fact we both have, in some ways outside a political consensus of a sort. But I suppose a difference I think between me and you, and that's what I partly want to explore, is in terms of my beliefs, I'm very optimistic. Kind of hope drives what I believe in. This
You
sense.
poor thing.
Well, this is what I want to talk to you about, you see, because I think, despite
What a miserable life you must be.
well, we'll see. You know, I'll have a life of disappointment, I'm sure. But you know, despite the fact the odds seem stacked against a lot of what I believe in, I still have this sense of things. You know, there is a sense that you know, history is the illusion of every era. It's temporary, it's transient, and it can change often quite dramatically.
Yes, certainly
But
can do
you
that.
seem very pessimistic about your beliefs. You seem, you know, a lot of the stuff you write about, you've got the passion for your beliefs, but you seem completely defeatist. You don't think.
I'm relaxed. I realise in the evening of my days, which I've now pretty much reached, I realise that I have.
Daft.
I realise that most of these struggles are futile. That they aren't, even where they succeed. And I hope to some extent that your utopia doesn't come about, because you will hate it more than anybody else.
But I'm
does
not a
when
utopian.
when it arrives.
Not a utopian.
Okay, well, a mild utopia. It's a semi-utopia. Whatever it is, I hope that your ideals aren't fulfilled, because you will be the person most disappointed in them.
In what way? What do you mean?
Oh, because it will not work out the way you thought it would. And it's absolutely true that it's better to travel, hopefully, than to arrive at all these things. The actual practical application of the noblest idea turns out, at the very best, to be tedious, and at the worst, to be often very different from what you'd hoped for.
Although I think the real utopians were the Thatcherites. They had a very ideological view of how society should be.
Well, there's something in
opposed-
what you say, that though they adopted the utopian view to justify what they'd done already, I don't think many of them actually set out to do what Thatcherism was invented. They made it up as they went along.
Before we go on to the other point, not just your pessimism, but you often, when you tweet your articles, you often refer to yourself as the hated Peter Hitchens.
Yeah, well, it's quite funny, isn't it? I am.
It is
hated.
funny, but you're not. Is that how
Well,
you
there are
see
people who
yourself?
hate me. Yeah, and I've written a small blog essay this week on why this is, which is that I'm not apologetic about being a moral and social conservative. It's perfectly all right in a society dominated by moral and social liberals to be an apologetic conservative who clearly knows his place. But my problem is I don't know my place, and my other problem is that I use against my opponents the very raucous, slightly rude methods that they are used to using against people like me, and they're quite surprised by that. And a lot of my brother's admirers, if they come along onto my Twitter feed and they insult me, and I come back and I'm quite rude back to them, oh, you can't be like, how, you know, so you're a Christian, are you, and you're really horrible. And I say, yes, as a matter of fact, there is quite a lot of instance in the Gospel of Christ being fairly rude to his detractors. There's nothing new about that. But these are people who admired Christopher for swiping his opponents quite severely. But when it's applied against them, are shocked to find a conservative doing it back. So that's it, I think, that I don't accept that fundamentally I'm inferior and wrong, and that I hit back with the weapons which they think are their own.
When you get that abuse, I mean, when you know, whether it be a group of people who hate you or the abuse you get, does that upset you? Some of the
Not
things.
particularly, no. I know what upsets me far more is the inability to communicate. That you simply cannot get some very simple things across to people, and you feel after a while. Always treat a mind as open until you've discovered otherwise, but you feel after a while, after a few exchanges, that what you're dealing with is a mind which is hopelessly closed and a person who doesn't know how to respond to arguments. So you make a point and they neither rebut it nor acknowledge it. I don't mind, they can do either. But as long as they do one. But if you make a point and they just ignore it and change the subject as if you've never said it, then that's not an argument. As I said, it's arguing with people who don't know how to argue is like playing chess with a squirrel. There's no future in it.
I mean, it comes across sometimes. You see yourself as you're surrounded in this kind of socially liberal myths, you know. This
Well,
kind
I
of,
am.
and you're this kind of lone voice trying to speak out against.
I don't know about
the-
alone, but there aren't that many of us.
Do you not think the Express, the Mail, the Sun, they provide a big platform
Well, they
for
provide a
social
platform,
moral
but that doesn't mean
conservative-
total agreement. And a lot of the things that conservative papers support, I use the term loosely, particularly the Conservative Party itself, to my mind, as socially liberal as the Guardian.
That's what I want to ask you about, because people, again, you call yourself a moral and social conservative and unapologetically so, but you're not a Tory. In fact, you're very hostile to the modern Tories.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, someone just asked me this for a preliminary to a conference, and I'll give you the same answer I gave to them. Because it calls itself the Conservative Party. If it called itself the Socialist Workers' Party, I wouldn't have anything against it.
It's not it's not a left-wing party.
It's a left-wing party. It's egalitarian. It's openly and declaredly egalitarian.
But you see the distinction between a Trotskyist
it's opposed to the maintenance of the married family, which is the absolute pillar of moral and social conservatism. It's opposed to national independence. It's completely wedded to our membership of a supranational European Union, which robs us of sovereignty. I could go on in many other ways and list the things that it does. That it's got much more in common with the SWP than it has with Conservatives.
Do you think the...
I often hear David Cameron and George Osborne coming out with things which I used to say when I was a Trot.
Well, let's think about
the difference is that I knew when I said them that they were Trotskyist things to say. They have no idea. They are left-wing, but they don't know they're left-wing.
But do you think...
Which is even more alarming in some ways. At least Jeremy Corbyn knows he's left-wing.
Do you think a socialist party would privatise public services, impose austerity?
No, there's all these, as I set out long ago in my 1999 book, The Abolition of Britain, that's not what politics is about anymore. Politics ceased to be about public ownership, it ceased to be about the Soviet Union, all that, in the period between the 1960s and the 1980s. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, it was quite clear, and the Euro-communists who pretty much shaped New Labour knew this perfectly well. The struggle was from now on was going to be about moral and social issues, not about ownership. Who needs ownership when you can regulate? There's absolutely no point for a state can have just as much control over the economy with regulation as it can with ownership, and less responsibility.
So
why not do that? So all that's gone, but the intervention in private life, that you can denationalise the railways and then nationalise childhood. Which is what all
childhood?
Yes. The whole idea of public policy towards childhood now is that children should spend as much time as they possibly can away from their mothers.
But isn't that...
That's subsidised. I am taxed so that children can actually be put in nurseries so their mothers can go out and work in call centres and not have anything to do.
When you were sent to boarding school when you were younger, you were separated from your parents.
Am I recommending this as a course of action? No. I'm saying it happened.
But this,
it's what my parents believed, good-heartedly, but in my view incorrectly, was the right thing to do.
Well, the Conservative government, they've introduced a tax break for married couples. That's the sort of moral and social...
It's a token. I think anybody can see that it's a token. It's a tiny sum of money. What actually needs to be done for marriage is to re-privilege it in far greater ways. The real blow struck at marriage was struck in all major Western societies in the 1960s by the introduction of what was in effect no-fault divorce, which means that, and once you've heard this summary you'll never ever be able to get out of your mind, it means that although two people may have sworn a solemn oath to stay together for the rest of their lives, if one of them decides that that oath no longer counts and that one person is going to abandon the marriage, if the other one seeks to abide by his or her oath and to maintain the marriage and wants to stay in the home and keep the marriage together, the state will intervene up to and including dragging them out of the house with force and threatening them with prison to break up that private relationship. That's what I mean by the nationalisation of childhood and indeed the nationalisation of personal life. And there is absolutely no suggestion, there has been none since the 1960s in any major political party, that the introduction of that form of divorce was a mistake. But it's completely altered the relation between the state and the individual person.
But surely with a relationship, look, it's tragic when relationships break apart, often. And, you know, when people get married, they intend in their minds.
We can have that argument if you want, but you're missing the point I'm making if you want to argue about the rights,
I'm just saying you can't
and wrongs
force
of
a
it.
couple
I'm simply
together,
saying
surely.
that here is a colossal alteration.
Okay.
In the relationship between the individual and the state, the relationship between the family and the state, the relationship between the child and the state and the child and the family. It is a huge social and moral revolution. And it's one which all the major political parties support, either by default or actively, and wish in some ways to take further. And it's one which crucially, not just the political parties, but the bench of judges, and indeed Lady Hale and the Supreme Court, have been specific about. That they actually really don't see that marriage, as it was before the 1960s, has any real purpose in our society left at all.
Do you think the fact a woman...
Whether you like it or not, and so we can argue all kinds of arguments, whether you like it or not, that is a major change in society, and one which is, in my view, far more revolutionary than who owns the gas board.
Do you think the fact a woman and a woman or a man and a man can marry has any impact on your
No,
marriage?
I think it's a side effect of it. I think that it's a consequence of the collapse of heterosexual marriage, and I regret now getting involved in the argument about same-sex marriage because it was a Stalingrad, a diversion. There are principled arguments that one might make about it, but nobody listens, and also it wasn't the point. Why is one worrying about a few thousand people who want to have same-sex marriages while not being concerned at all about the collapse of heterosexual marriage, which involves millions of people and millions of children?
I mean, it used to be more acceptable to be publicly prejudiced about gay people, about women, about people who aren't white. Isn't it a good thing that it's now less acceptable?
Yeah, unequivocally a good thing, yeah.
But isn't that often what, because you talk about political correctness, isn't that all that
I talk
really
about
is?
political correctness, and I am ambivalent about political correctness. I always make the point, say the reason why it has been such an effective weapon is that it's based most fundamentally on getting people to behave with good manners towards other people. And if it weren't for that, it wouldn't have had any impact at all. Mm-hmm. It's its other implications where it moves into making certain things unsayable and therefore certain thoughts unthinkable, where it becomes a malign influence. But of course it's got positive and benevolent aspects, or it would never have got as far as it had.
This is flitting, I just remembered though. You've called for the breakup of the Conservative Party before. Do you stand by
Well,
that?
I hope that it would break up. I simply underestimated the enormous power of lies and money, which enable the Conservative Party to obtain a victory in the elections. I wouldn't say they won, because I think what was done was an immensely clever and expensive targeted campaign in certain constituencies. And interestingly, I don't live in one of those constituencies. I live in Oxford East, which is one of the tiny red islets in southern England. And there was never any possibility on the list of Tory target seats that it would go their way, so they ignored it. And during the last election, Andrew Smith, the MP, actually increased his majority. So there was no national trend. What there was a fantastically clever, well-targeted, very costly campaign by the Conservatives in targeted constituencies, which won them a technical victory on points, which they did. It wasn't a moral victory. Nobody really won that election morally, but it was quite sufficient for them to form a majority government, and it was more effective than they thought it would be.
You seem
I
quite
don't
angry
have any
about.
doubt about that at all.
You seem quite angry about the way and the
I
pieces
am
you
angry
written
about it
how
because it was the last chance, and I thought that the 2010 election was a bad moment. I thought that I appealed to my readers in 2010 very much not to vote Conservative, because I thought the last thing we need to do is to save the Conservative Party at this stage. And I thought, and I still think, that in 2010, if the Conservative Party had lost the election badly enough for everyone to realise it had lost, instead of losing it as it did, not badly enough for everyone to realise that it had lost, then that would have been it. It wouldn't have been 4 election defeats in succession. No political party could have survived that practically. It wouldn't be able to raise funds, it wouldn't be able to keep members, people would have sought something else.
Why not UKIP?
2015 was a sort of... Political parties in this country grow out of the death of other political parties. The Labour Party grew out of the death of the Liberal Party. The Tory Party has to die first.
But UKIP
is a means, but not an end. UKIP is, in any case, it's exile Thatcherism. It's not actually a socially or morally conservative party. Its leader believes in drug decriminalisation, as I ceaselessly point out.
Indeed. How would you sum up David Cameron and what he stands for?
I don't think he stands for anything. I think he stands for obtaining office for the sons of gentlemen. He's jolly good at it. He's quite likeable. I can't feel any passion against him. It's impossible. I feel passion against a blancmange. A perfectly nice chap, I'm sure, but he has absolutely no interest in changing anything. He has a great deal of interest in maintaining things as they are and in being in office while they're maintained.
The Tory politician Enoch Powell in the 60s, he had a very apocalyptic vision of what immigration would do to Britain. But if we look at Britain today, we've got some of the highest levels of mixed-race relationships on Earth, mixed-race children on the planet. In communities where there's higher levels of immigration, that tends to be where a party like UKIP does worse. They often do better in areas with very little immigration. Do you think immigration's been generally a good thing?
Enoch Powell was a disaster for the whole discussion of the subject of immigration, because that speech was a disgrace. And it seems to be no person of conscience can look at that speech and think that it should have been made or that a decent person could have made it. I'm very much of the Enoch was wrong persuasion, and I regret enormously the speech was made, because it did have the piccaninnies and the excrement through the letterbox. It did have elements in it which were demagogic, and also which if some oaf had made it, then you could say, well, that's an oaf. But a man of the intellect of Enoch Powell could not make such a speech without being completely aware of what he was doing, and that's what makes it even more disgraceful. So it made it very, very difficult ever afterwards for anybody to argue that case without being accused of following the same, essentially, in my view, careerist path, trying to gain office on the basis of whipping up I won't say a hysteria, but a feeling. So as for the rest of it, I think that although there are undoubted problems and there are solitudes facing each other, I mean, the intermarriage is great, but if you go to places like Bradford, what you will find is not integration, but you will find two solitudes with their backs more or less turned upon each other, not in a hostile way, but in a...
Parallel lives, you mean?
Much as the French Canadians and the Anglo-Canadians don't really talk to each other. They don't know each other. They will cross each other's paths at work, on public transport, and in the centre of the city, and then they'll go back to their separate worlds.
Isn't that an argument partly for abolishing faith schools? So instead of segregating children by the religious...
No, oddly enough, a lot of the interesting thing you'll find in these Pennine towns is that a lot of the schools which are now thoroughly Muslim are actually Church of England schools. So okay. No, I mean, you can have an argument about faith schools, but that I don't think would play much part in it.
You used to be a non-believer.
Yes.
Now you're a Christian.
Yes.
To what extent, I mean, that kind of, your religious convictions, do you see that as very much the underlying kind of basis of your political position?
I think it has to be the basis of any position. I'm troubled by anybody who doesn't have a religious opinion of any kind, because if they don't, how can they have any other sort of opinion? It has to be the foundation. A set of opinions without a religious underpinning would be like a house without foundations, and I think would be likely to fall down and certainly very easily blown over in the wind.
We're one of the most irreligious countries on earth now. Why do you think that is?
Mainly the First World War.
Oh, go on.
The churches in this country made the grave mistake of almost all the establishment in this country of supporting the First World War. They called it a great war for civilization. They urged people to go and fight in it, and it was one of the most deeply immoral things this country has ever asked its people to take part in, and it was a catastrophe, and they cannot conceivably survive a mistake on that scale, and they haven't. I think it's true over most of formerly Christian Europe. Christianity, the end of Christianity as a serious, dominant, believed faith, dates from between 1914 and 1918.
It's interesting, again, as someone...
It took some time, as things do, to reach its full extent, but I think that is why Europe is now largely irreligious, and why North America, from more or less the same tradition, is not.
You see, that will surprise people too, of your political convictions, because people like myself on the left will look at World War I as one of the greatest the greatest avoidable tragedy in human history, which laid the basis for a whole host of other tragedies which defined the 20th century. And people might expect you to say, to wrap yourself in the flag and
well, they might, but they'd be, as so often, mistaken.
So how do you feel, the way it's being portrayed now, and it's obviously a century since World War I began, how do you feel in the way it's been commemorated?
Inadequately. I think an awful lot of particularly the history books which were published at the time were, and I'm going to be cross here because I can't remember the name of one of them, but a lot of the history books which were published on the centenary were the rehash of the same old thing, as if the centre of the war was Flanders. The central struggle was that between Britain and Germany, with France maybe playing a part, and a lot of battles. And then we end up with Wilfred Owen, and that's it. Then you have the tremendous work by Adam Tooze, The Deluge, which is what it was really about, where the centre of it was actually in more or less in Ukraine, where the struggle was fundamentally between Germany and Russia, where we played a more or less walk-on part, and need not, in my view, even have got in, and were at the end of it effectively defeated. And the great paradox is, a lot of people believe, wrongly as it happens, that we went to war because of a German naval threat, because our naval supremacy was threatened by Germany. At the end of the First World War, we conceded to the United States, which was supposedly our ally, the very naval supremacy we'd supposedly gone to war to protect. That was the end of it. And we lost the war to the United States, who were our ally for the last quarter of it. The Twos is just fantastic. It's proper history. It's pure mountaineer history. As you read it, you will learn hundreds of things you never knew or never fully understood about the First World War. If people read that, then they wouldn't look back on it quite so so much sentimentality. The other book, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, but I can't, and I should have come prepared for this, is a very good brief book about the real argument in the cabinet about whether we should join the war, demonstrating the more or less total irrelevance of the Belgian neutrality treaty, which was not actually a proper pretext for war, and the absolute correctness of people such as John Burns and John Morley in the cabinet, who argued against it, and the way in which Churchill and Grey more or less made the war a fait accompli before it was possible for the cabinet to stop it. And the shocking treatment of Parliament by Grey on the night of his speech, which when you read the debate, I went back to the old Hansard, which thanks to those wonderful people who've archived it, you can now read the debate. There was no vote. It was basically a railroading of Parliament by shockingly unscrupulous, almost comparable to the way in which we were railroaded into the Iraq War, rushed and hurried into a war in which we had no real power. Really shocking. And why a patriot should be in favour of a war which bankrupted this country, which destroyed its naval supremacy, and which turned it forever afterwards into a debtor and client nation, I can't see.
And laid the foundations, of course, for the calamity of World War II as well.
Well, World War II was simply the second half. But that also, there are so many ways in which it is not a conservative event. And wars are never conservative anyway. Wars are always a wonderful moment for revolutionaries, provided the circumstances for the Russian Revolution.
That's what Engels said, didn't he? The handmaiden of revolutions.
It's not just the revolution, but also the handmaiden of nationalisation of control. This country at the beginning of the First World War, the famous A.J.P. Taylor point, hardly anyone ever met the state, except in the form of the postman or the policeman. And after the First World War, everything in life was regulated and dominated by state control in a way that people would have thought unthinkable before. I think I've been trying for days for another reason to find a reference to this. Paul Cambon, the French ambassador to Britain in 1914, wrote in 1918 that he believed the country had been through a revolution as great as the one that France had gone through in 1789. And I think he was right. It was a different country at the end.
You mentioned Churchill there.
A worse one.
What's your overall view of Winston Churchill?
Sceptical.
Again, you see, this is interesting. Again, people might expect you to venerate.
One good thing.
Okay.
One unquestionably good thing. At the time, in 1940, that he became Prime Minister, when the war had already begun and had reached the stage that it became, he was probably the only person who could have refused to make terms with Hitler. And that was utterly and completely the right thing to do. To have sought terms would have been a catastrophe.
But what don't you like about him?
I don't like his enthusiasm for war. I don't like his blithe willingness to rewrite history to suit his own case. I particularly dislike his role in getting us into war in 1914.
Which is what you just mentioned there. Margaret Thatcher as well, another great icon, of course, of conservatism, but again, you're very sceptical of
Yes,
Thatcher.
I mean, you cannot but admire her as a person, fighting her way with absolute determination up from not particularly auspicious beginnings, not being put off, becoming Prime Minister. Who can say that is a minor achievement? But in terms of the political, economic and social legacy, it's a wholly different story, and certainly not a very conservative one. I don't doubt her personal instincts were conservative, but very little of what she did in government was.
Well, it's interesting you talk about moral and social conservatism, because arguably one of the legacies of Thatcherism was to accelerate, for example, in terms of, if you look what happened at that period in terms of marriage breakups, the rise of...
completely. But
I don't know whether it be teenage pregnancies...
There's a continuum. And again, I made this point in my great unread book, The Abolition of Britain, that Harold Wilson and Roy Jenkins began it. She finished it, and I will happily concede to any left-wing person that Margaret Thatcher did a lot of social damage to this country if they will concede that Harold Wilson and Roy Jenkins did some too. I have had no takers.
Okay, fair enough. I'll sidestep that one because fortunately I'm asking.
I thought you might be the
I'm
first.
asking the question, so I can get away with it.
It would be amusing. Though,
It would be. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the main threats, you mentioned the abolition of Britain in your book. What are the main threats you see it, threatening this country?
No, it's not a question of threats. I mean, it's finished.
It's not. Do you really think this is your pessimism coming through again?
Finished. I mean,
Why
I've never
is it
seen a
finished?
country more finished.
Why is
well,
it
for a
finished?
start, we're bankrupt.
We're not actually bankrupt.
We
though,
are
we?
bankrupt. We are 1.5 trillion pounds in debt. It's
That's not
unfair.
state.
That's the state.
But countries don't go bankrupt.
As individuals, yes, they do.
Even Zimbabwe didn't go bankrupt.
Germany went bankrupt in the 1920s.
Wasn't technically bankrupt though, was it?
I don't know about technically, but I don't care about technically.
It had a lot of debt. We have a lot of debt.
It was money died.
Okay.
And the consequences of that, the middle class were destroyed, and the consequences of that seem to me to be fairly obviously bad.
But we've had higher debt in our history.
We don't have, yes, but it's as a result of war. This is not a result of war. This is a result of peacetime, and there's no excuse for it. By the way, you could add to that debt, though it's mathematically meaningless now. You could add to that debt the colossal amount of money we still owe to the United States, which we defaulted on over the First World War. Most people, I actually have arguments with people, they refuse to believe this, but it is the case. We defaulted on our debt to the US for the First World War. That's why they wouldn't lend us anything in 1939. We had actually defaulted. We have still not paid it. People think we have, but we haven't. We are so in debt, and we're now in debt both as a country and also in debt as individuals, to an extent which is completely unrepayable. It cannot be done.
Well, we're one of the most personally indebted countries.
The only way you could ever repay that debt would be to have hyperinflation.
But that's interesting.
Which is, of course, not to be ruled out. But so there's that, and a debtor has no power, either over anybody else or over himself to rescue himself. We have abandoned our own national sovereignty, so we don't actually govern ourselves anymore to the European Union. So we have no power in that sense. We've also made another, in my view, equally serious sacrifice, in that we have abandoned our national history. So most people no longer know what it actually means to be British or English. It's gone. They have absolutely no idea of how this became about. We actually have a Prime Minister who can't translate Magna Carta and who's never heard of the Bill of Rights. But just for example, if I talk to people about the Civil War, I've talked to quite bright people in schools and universities. They know nothing. I had a conversation, I won't say who this was, with somebody who I believed that they had studied GCSE history and didn't know which side Cromwell was on in the Civil War. We don't know anything about our past. We are amnesiacs. And an amnesiac is, if you woke up in the hospital not knowing who you were, you'd be everybody's victim, wouldn't you?
But do you think that
there's nobody you couldn't be fooled by?
I mean,
this is what we are. We can be fooled. We can be fooled by politicians so easily. And they come along and they fool us over Iraq. And a few years later, they try and do the same to us over Ukraine. There was a serious attempt to get us into a kind of war footing with Russia over Ukraine. Exactly the same methods used. And everybody fell for it.
Not everybody.
Almost. The same people, the same people who fell for Iraq fell for that. And they very nearly fell for Syria as well. And most people still believe that we should have, and a lot of people, I should put this, in the British media, still believe that we were wrong to stay out of Syria.
Yeah. And then there's Libya.
Many people.
Well.
The Libyan catastrophe remains unexamined. Go on about Chilcot. Okay, I'd love to have the Chilcot report published, but I'd really like to see somebody compiling a report on the catastrophic intervention in Libya.
It's rarely spoken about, isn't it? The consequences.
And it was just as disastrous. It is the principal cause of what is now happening in the Mediterranean.
And just that point about history, I mean, that includes remembering certainly our great history of people struggling against authority, the Levellers, the Chartists, the suffragettes.
Huge part of our history, and it's one of the reasons why the government very nearly got away with identity cards, very nearly got away with immensely long periods of pre-trial detention, and has got rid of the rule against double jeopardy, and has got rid of the right of silence. Unbelievable in a country with such a history. These things have happened, and in many cases been done by supposedly conservative persons.
A couple of other things.
Once you've robbed yourself of, or been robbed of your history, that's the kind of thing that happens to you all the time. People can constantly reach into your wallet or your handbag and take everything else you've got.
because you don't remember the great tradition.
You don't know what it matters. You're like someone wandering the streets of Peking, asking people, is this note worth anything? Is this enough for a cup of coffee? They might be nice. They might, on the other hand, take a £20 note for your cup of coffee.
Take liberties with even more. Yeah.
If you don't know anything, you are a child, and we are nationally we're a child. So with all those things, bankrupt, non-sovereign, robbed of our culture and our past, we have no power to save ourselves. The next proper history of this country will be written in Chinese.
A couple of other things. Jeremy Corbyn is obviously standing to leave the Labour Party. He's unexpectedly gone from, 200 to 1 to being the front runner.
This is very funny, isn't it?
What's happened, in your opinion? What's this phenomenon? I mean, he's doing these meetings all over the country, thousands of people, all very enthused from all sorts of different backgrounds.
I think it's. It could have all kinds of unpredictable consequences partly because of the extreme vulnerability of our economic supposed recovery, but leaving that out of it, I think it's an awful lot of people sick of being told what to do, and I also think it's because of the observable fact that the Blairite project originated in the kitchens and pantries of Euro-communism has now been taken over by the Conservative Party, and therefore has no need of the Labour Party to continue it. The Labour Party has been freed of its need to be Blairite anymore.
So it's left a vacuum.
So it's in some ways it's a sort of spasm of, okay, all right then, we're free at last, we can do this, and then as all the Blairite media and the David Miliband's and the Peter Mandelsons come crowding in to say, don't do this. The impulse to say, well, if he says don't do it, that's absolutely what I must do, just grows stronger and stronger, doesn't it?
They become the campaign managers.
It's a very good demonstration that we still have a strong national sense of humour.
Do you think he could do unexpectedly well if he does become leader?
Who knows? It would be unexpected if he did. I mean, that's the whole thing. I don't know. Most conventional wisdom about everything is wrong. So don't rule it out. And for all we know, he has tremendously hidden debts. I don't see any sign of it so far, but you never know.
He's a full-time.
They are, of course, hidden debts by their nature are hidden.
Well, I think he's probably genuinely one of the nicest people I've met.
I've never met him. I don't imagine he'd be keen to meet me.
Well, I don't know.
I think
he's very open-minded.
I think he dwells in that left-wing world where virtue is actually established by opinions, and I would be an unvirtuous person.
I'm not sure that's true. He's actually
I'm
very
not
generous.
sure, but I would be unsurprised.
Some people on the left are like that. Some people definitely are, and they don't want to, have these sorts of discussions or conversations. I don't think he's like that. Some are. They're purists, and they like to think of people like you as evil, bad.
You never know. I think it's possible. Anyway, we haven't met. It's probably a bit late now.
Finally, do you have any optimism whatsoever about the future of Britain and what it can become?
No.
Why?
Why should I? I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, if I turn out to be wrong, it'll be a pleasant surprise. If I turn out to be right, I'll be prepared for it.
Isn't that unpatriotic in a weird way?
Don't see why. I mean, I don't think lying to yourself would ever be patriotic.
But surely, throughout history, regardless, we want very different outcomes in terms of what society would look like. But people throughout our history, surely the lesson of this country is people fought what seemed like insurmountable odds and overcame them.
The lesson of history is that civilizations which don't defend themselves disappear.
Do you think we're going to go the way of the Roman Empire?
I don't know about the Roman Empire. I don't know what way we're going to go. I mean, you look, for instance, at Eastern and Central Europe, all kinds of places which used to be major powers are now forgotten. I think we've had a good long run at it, but the past century we've made a very big pig's ear of it, and I think we're pretty much bound to pay the price.
But what would that price be?
I don't know exactly. I'm not a prophet. But I don't think, as I say, I think that all the tendencies, particularly the underlying economic ones and the moral ones and the ability to control our own destiny, they all point the same way.
So pretty bleak.
Yeah. But as it happens, it's still in between the crisis and the catastrophe. We may as well have a glass of champagne. But it is not.
I can't do that. I'll be called a champagne socialist, but you feel free.
I don't suppose that's really much of an insult anymore, is it? I thought it was the Tories who weren't allowed to drink champagne.
Maybe not. I don't know. I've had
That's
worse.
George Osborne's rule.
Look, it's been an absolute pleasure. You a gentleman as
Likewise.
ever. So great to see you, Peter. Good to see you. Good to see you.